Thank you so much for coming in. This is a bit of a meandering discussion, I think, because I'm sort of interviewing myself. But I thought I would share some thoughts on this theme because I've published 2 novels now, and the second one came out earlier this year. And the second one was very much written in the aftermath of the experience of having an audience that can communicate with you for the first time. Because when I wrote my first book, I didn't think about those kinds of things at all. And I realize now that the experience is quite formative. So I have some thoughts, I have some quotes, and I'm very interested in audience questions at the end. And maybe we'll kind of share this speculative conversation about the relationship between a writer and their readers. I'm going to start by reading the first section of my second novel, We Were Young, because I'm going to braid some of my thoughts and remarks into the experience of writing and experiencing the reception of this novel. So I'll just read the opening section and then I'll give you the context. In a bare room with a sacred heart, a tin tub full of water issues steam gingerly under hanging lamps. Cormac can see other people lined along the walls, pressing back against cement, and hear at intervals the shuffle of their feet. There is a thin chair with a backrest like a fan. Cormac watches his friend and latterly colleague Alice sit in this. The gesture marks her as involved. A girl, an actress or an artist, enters from behind a partition. She wears a white gown. It seems more of an aesthetic choice than a concession to historical accuracy. The girl walks slowly and stiffly, and her face is closed in pain. On reaching the bath, the girl begins to undo the gown, to pluck at buttons, and in the time this takes, its excruciation, Cormac detaches to check out the setup and the props. He notices an incongruously modern light switch by the door. Rain rushes over one of the long, deep window panes and leaks arching through apertures. Someone, a middle-aged woman, moves closer to the bath. She crouches down. All wait. Cormac is 37 and has been moving in art circles for a long time. He sees himself watching and watching the watching and still feels awkward about it. The actress, naked, steps into the bath. Her stomach is soft and she has no pubic hair. Tan lines mime a swimsuit which seems decadent in November. Cormac feels aroused and panics slightly. Why did they have to choose an actress with a taut, sexy body? Is that really necessary? Are you supposed to ignore that? Please, the girl says, can you pass me the soap? A bar of soap, dry and sharp-cornered like a block of white cheese, sits in a dish. The middle-aged woman springs from her hunkers and hands the soap to the girl. Alice does not, however, stir. She watches intently as the girl begins to lather, shivering, as the girl begins to keen softly, wincing and gasping just. The pain is centered on her breasts. She moves as though her breasts are agonizing. She has pop-up, youthful breasts which are nice to look at. Cormac tries not to look. Someone is singing somewhere upstairs, voices, and it is, of course, Ave Maria, gratia plena. Sitting forward in the water, the girl whispers to them, do you know where my baby is? She asks, do you know when my father is coming for me? It was 2 months ago I was left here, I think. The women shake their heads, no. Do you, the girl looks at Alice, do you know where my baby is? I don't, Alice replies. She clears her throat. Cormac cannot see her face now, only the carved black bob of her hair. The mention of a baby is painful, and he doesn't want to think about it. Some more people have entered this phase of the show, so he moves away from the wall and leaves. He takes the opportunity of folding himself into a group shuffling out. In the next room, there stands a coffin on wheels and stems. 2 girls keeping watch in aprons and smocks, a hush, a peephole in the wall, a grill, the face of a woman glaring back at them. This room is worse, he thinks. All coffins take him back to the first coffin of life. That coffin on its stems, indenting a marshy rug before the fireplace, still tips into his dreams sometimes to roll idly down inclines like a child's disaster pram. Impishly, Cormac figures, I'll say this to Alice. I was triggered. Alice, unbelievably, is still in the previous section. The sequence he guesses has one or two more installments. A door to the side of his eye discloses frantic movement in the small adjacent room. Cormac thinks, it's so small, if I move in there, someone will implicate me and I'll have to go along with it. Better stay put. A young woman has approached the coffin and is reading the nameplate. Her red hair is caught at the back, half knotted in a scarf, and by the low lights her complexion is peaches and cream. She does not have the face of a model, but the rosy distribution of her features could be made to look achingly noble, achingly delicate. As he thinks this, she becomes conscious of his attention and looks up, alarmed. Cormac turns away to face a blacked-out window with despair. Alice has progressed. She is sliding into an alcove in a corner of the room. Cormac wonders if, at this point, Alice is tormenting him, if it has started to become comical to her. Watching her now, he can see she is absorbed. She was not afraid of the naked actress. What? Asked the woman at the coffin suddenly. Cormac stares. The room has been so quiet, but for Ave Maria upstairs, the muffled sounds of action in the small adjacent room. Now everyone, the audience against the walls, is looking at him. What? Repeats the girl. She's glaring at Cormac. He cannot tell if she is an actress or a member of the audience. Has he been staring at her? No, she is an actress or unhinged. He looks back and shakes his head. Don't bring me into this. What? Oh God, is she an actress or not? The women in smocks sitting in chairs do not look up. She has to be an actress then. And yet she wears a raincoat, a pashmina scarf. Facing him, her cheeks are high and flush with body heat. I don't know what you mean, Cormac says weakly. From her alcove, Alice leans forward. She is smiling ever so slightly at him. She is watching with everyone else. Do you know the way out? The girl asks him now. Cormac's heart sinks. No, he says. The audience, blissfully left out of this shit, continues to watch him with interest. You must know, the girl insists. Well, I mean, there's a door downstairs, Cormac says. He hears a rustle of laughter and feels emboldened a little by this. The girl does not respond. Cormac jumps when a hand sneaks onto his shoulder. It's another actress, demonstrably in a smock this time, and she whispers, "Come with me." This new actress leads him back the way they came, but instead of turning into the room, she pushes a fire escape and reveals a staircase to the street. Cormac feels the blast of the evening, sees the greasy glint of rain. The actress says, "Run." And then, as he advances towards the stairs, "Come back through the front if you like." The steps lead to a side street of sack-like cottages where the rain has stopped and it's peaceful, with windows of television tumult and lamplight. He turns and sees the wide gap of Dorset Street. A kebab shop flashes green and yellow neon palm trees, yellow, green. Behind, the fire door smashes shut. Oh, thank God, Cormac says out loud, laughing. On the pavement, as people are exiting the building in pairs, Alice pulls on her gloves. What did you think of that, she asks. Intense, Cormac decides. Really intense. So that is the first section of the book, and that's the first break. And when I wrote it, I did worry that people might come for me a little bit, because it's effectively like a slightly sarcastic rendering of an immersive play about the Magdalen laundries. And in this book, I'm writing about Cormac, who's a man who, when I was writing it, I thought 37 was very old. I realize now that he's probably more like 45, but I was 29 when I started writing it. And essentially, he is a sort of chronically single, rather lovable, but ultimately quite isolated man who has gone from a working class upbringing to moving in art circles and is sort of not really making art for the duration of this book. He's really just teaching photography and sleeping with various women and men, in particular women who are younger than him. And he returns to see this play again to ask out the actress who has been interrogating him. But one of the running gags I had in the book was the idea that every art event Cormac goes to is in some way responding to historical violence against women in Ireland. And as a man, he feels implicated and blamed for it and resents this because his own backstory shows he's not had a tremendous amount of agency, but at the same time, he can't really escape from it either. So I tried to drive it into directions that are increasingly funny, and I tried to make a lot of the female creators around him rather self-absorbed and irritating. And I say this because I was trying to provoke the reader a little in an atmosphere where talking about women in Ireland and talking about our experiences and our legacies had become quite mainstream in many ways. And this was partly a sense I got from the reception to my own book, my first book. And I was trying to look at it quite mischievously from this other perspective. That wasn't my main intention with the book. It was sort of a side issue, but it was something I decided to play with. And so what I'm going to just talk about now a little bit is the idea of how do you set out through the medium of a realist novel at this moment in history to make remarks on politics and history and personality and experience that don't fall into quite obvious binaries. So it's also significant that in this opening scene, Cormac, who's a poser, is in this confected scenario where it's made to look as if he's in a historical moment, but really it's quite artificial, and it's not clear what emotional response you're supposed to have to having someone say, what, and can you tell me the way out, and you must be responsible for this. That it isn't clear where blame lies in the narrative for various things like betrayal in love, or perhaps sexual cruelty, or indifference towards women in particular. Those kind of questions were what it's processing through, but it also spends an awful lot of time walking around Dublin city in a way that is, I wanted to continuously name the city very clearly and play with the idea that it's very difficult to inhabit a city like Dublin in literature in a way that feels new, because it's been written about so much and because of Ulysses. So in every moment in this book, I want you, the reader, and Cormac to feel as if you kind of can't really move. There's this great claustrophobic weight of culture. So all that is quite esoteric, but I'll tell you a little bit about how I got to that point. So as Sheila said, my first novel, This Happy, came out in 2020. I wrote that novel largely in isolation and largely on the dole and getting a bursary. And only when it was sold to a publisher in London did I encounter any sense of myself as a product and the book as a product, which is a realization you must come to. But it was the story of first-person narrative, first of all, written from the perspective of a young woman who was recalling an affair with a married man when she was 23, and then talking about her current rather strategic marriage. And so it was sort of a monologue. It was a lot of very intense emotional states. One editor described it to me as, one of those books about brainy and alienated young women that are very hot at the moment. And it was a very unself-conscious book. And I look at it now as a kind of very gauche. And I find myself kind of feeling dear thoughts towards it, but also being a little bit alarmed at the amount of intensity I had when I wrote it in my mid-20s. But ultimately, when I appeared in the world, of course, the way I was meta-marketed and discussed was as a next Sally Rooney iteration on a conveyor belt of female writers from Ireland who were going to capitalise on the success of Sally Rooney. This was inevitable in some ways, and it was actually made explicit in a review by John Self of myself and Nisha Dolan, saying, why does the publishing industry want more Sally Rooney's? The real one is still here. And some things on, just some Twitter stuff, which shouldn't matter, but if somebody ats you into a conversation behind your back about how you're part of a set, one's vanity is pricked, but equally I knew. The truth is, when my book went to London and got to the top of a slush pile, the fact that I was a female writer under 40 from Ireland may have had something to do with me being read. So it felt very much like a poisoned chalice, and I didn't feel able to kick back against it too much because that would seem petty. But it was an interesting experience. So something I wanted to talk about originally here is the idea of what we expect now from novels by Irish women, or by women. I feel this moment is maybe closed, but the idea that the brainy and alienated young woman narrative was a moment in time that was trendy, as opposed to a moment in the longer history of realist writing that actually reflects a common experience of, I think, particularly femininity in Ireland. I think there's a commonality between my work, Sally Rooney's work, Nisha Dolan's work, Megan Nolan's work, Nicole Flattery's work. And in many cases, it's sort of a common feeling of disenchantment which is quite intellectualized. And I think the backdrop of Irish history is too important to ignore, but often not there, which is kind of a complicated way of saying that I think you can look at this historically as perhaps both a trend in market forces and a kind of document of what life is like for a certain demographic at a certain moment in time. And I'm going to read a quote now, which is about realism, realist writing. And when I'm describing the realist novel, I'm sort of talking about every novel that is realist. I'm talking about the tradition of realism. I'm also talking about the Hampstead novel, or the bourgeois novel, or the novel of middle-class morality tale, the novel of middle-class people whose lives are very intense, which is what I kind of write about. And this is a sort of cultural object. This is Ian McEwan being interviewed by the Irish Times about his most recent book. This is Kevin Power, reviewing that book and defending the idea of realist writing as really important. And he calls the mainstream realist novel is a tool for thinking. The mainstream realist novel both represents and interrogates consciousness itself, consciousness here defined as the feeling of what happens. And that end sentence, a feeling of what happens, made me think when I read it of John McGahern, who was a huge influence on me as a writer, talking about wanting to write the kind of books that capture only what happens, or ordinary life, or life as a series of sensation. And I think that was hugely what I wanted to do with this Happy. I wanted to describe the sensations of being young and being quite intelligent and full of appetite and very selfish and very charged and motivated by erotic feeling, and kind of meeting the indifference of various institutions that at the time of writing the book still felt very patriarchal. It seems important to me to say that I wrote that book before the Repeal the Eighth campaign. It was just a different space only a couple of years ago. And so I didn't really give the book a strong plot. And when I came to this one, I didn't give it a strong plot either, because I was so interested in writing about only what happens. When this Happy came out, one of the criticisms it tended to get was that it was plotless and self-indulgent, which it kind of is. But the idea that this would ever be a bad thing hadn't occurred to me. But I realized that, first of all, in signaling myself, which I didn't do but was done on my behalf, as the next Sally Rooney, if you enjoyed that and you've run through your Sally Rooney, pick up Niamh Campbell, frames expectations in a particular way. And this happens so emphatically in publishing now and in how things are publicized. It's not even concealed, the sense that you are going to satisfy someone's appetite for a certain writer. It's a very strange movement. But what it did was set up expectations so that there were, in particular, responses on the internet or Goodreads reviews that explicitly complained I wasn't Rooney enough, or I was expecting this and I got this ridiculous. In one case, really, someone went through my sex scenes and just completely exploded how terrible they thought they were. And I was annoyed. There was a sort of relationship with the book as a product that is letting the reader down. And that was so interesting to go through, because it's your first book, it feels very personal. Sometimes the attacks are personal as well. People looked at where I'd gone to college, or different things, like how I looked, how much I weighed. It wasn't enormously invasive, but it did exist as a discourse. And once I'd seen it, I thought, I have looked into this void. How am I going to write a second book that's going to play with this response without leaning into it too much? But I decided not to give a plot. I still held out on that one. I just think there's something sinister about the idea that you would give an artificial shape to a story. But the response, and also it must be said, I got enormously positive responses as well. I was received very kindly by reviewers, which is probably why I got trashed on Goodreads, because it's sort of like, there's your karma. I did get surprising people reaching out and writing to me about the first book. Would have been equally divided between women in their 20s and 30s, who I would have expected to be the readership, and men in middle age. Enormous numbers of very thoughtful responses. And I think that's because the love interest in the book, who is a middle-aged man, who is sort of lionized by the protagonist in a sort of tongue-in-cheek kind of way, was dealt with, and this was intentional, with a lot of kindness. Because I had read fiction in which you had a sort of innocent, stupid, intense young girl and a predatory older man that didn't look at why would this girl with all this agency want to be in this situation? And the answer was, well, because she's motivated by lust and romantic attachment. And therefore, there's something there. It was like, if you want to give the young female figure agency, you need to accept she's got desires. And so that was my intention. I wanted you to feel sort of attracted to this person too, and it paid off. But that kind feedback I should also talk about too, because it's, there was negative and there was also positive. But the negative is what kind of does stick with you a little bit, and you start thinking, are they right? And then there were interesting publishing industry issues which kind of come out of London and America about whiteness. You're a white middle-class woman. Now, that is not always true, and that certainly doesn't speak particularly to an Irish situation, which tends to be more complicated, but it was like an easy stereotype that was there to kind of shut you down, I think, as a woman writer, if you wanted to talk about certain things, by wielding sort of soft Marxist arguments as well, which was sort of ironic because I consider it a socialist book. But with all of this going on in my mind, I thought, what on earth do I do next? I originally wanted to write a kind of State of the Nation group narrative, the kind of thing that I think Ian McEwan would like. I'm going to quote him again because there's another wonderful quote this is from the interview. Let me see, yes. The reason I bring this quote in is because something he talks about in this interview about his latest book is beginning in the first person. And this happy was written in the first person. It was me, I. It was this woman's voice in my head. And he says he switched from first to third in the course of writing his latest novel. And the moment you let the third person in, somehow you have a greater responsibility to what we commonly share as the world. And I do know what he means here. I felt in maturing from one book to the next, I needed to step away from the I, the me, the subject who just sees the world a certain way, and the book, you don't get a look in, you only see this person. That if you wanted to take an aerial view, you need to go into the third person, which also brings you kind of closer to the traditional realist novel in that it's trying to give you a view of as many people as possible. So I thought, I'm going to write a group narrative with several characters, and it's going to represent contemporary Irish culture. I'm going to do that. I'm not going to write about little girls who are horny. I'm going to write about, culture. And then I realized that my skills just hadn't reached that point yet. And it was just not persuasive. They all sounded the same. So I was thinking, which one of these characters am I fondest of? And it was Cormac. So I opted for third person, close. So it's in the third person, but you really only see things from Cormac's perspective until the end, which is a little bit of a cop-out, but it allowed me to write what I felt was a slightly cooler-headed book that maybe the audience would not hate as much. Something McEwan says as well about going into third person and writing State of the Nation literature or commentary on the world, not just the small world of one personality, but the world itself. He says, I think for my generation it's easier. I've noticed an awful lot of books written in a highly subjective first person these days, and I rather want these writers to get through their 20s and 30s and start naming the world. Take some responsibility for it, not just wallow in it. And I also really loved this idea because it was like, yes, I know what you mean, but I also know what you mean when you say it was easier for your generation and perhaps easier for someone writing novels in the 80s and 90s when they were respected as art forms a bit more, that you might come in, write a novel which might look at middle-class people in Hampstead but would be a comment on the government, would be a comment on the meaning of life. Whereas if you write, as I did, an intense narrative about a girl who's horny, it seems like a self-indulgent project. And what I've said just there a moment ago is I don't think these are as different as they appear. But the kind of writing that I was doing was reflecting an experience of the world. And I think this is shared by a lot of young writers, that we do not have access to the kind of command culturally or security culturally that would allow us to do State of the Nation writing persuasively. By that I mean precarious work, not being able to enter the housing market, often putting off having families until later, living in a kind of capitalist adolescence, means the idea that you would write about a grand family falling apart is just very alien. You know, what you're actually experiencing is a house share and a load of Tinder dates. Your sense of yourself and the world and human nature is coming through this content, and you want to write that instead. And I think we will see with time that this isn't a flash of trendiness. It's sort of like a real experience, which is why I say it's a very important historical document, some of these pieces of writing. But anyway, I did still want to try and be a little bit more mature and masculine. So I decided to write a book about Cormac, and I would do third person close so that you would have to see the world from a man's perspective. And I would also write about this art scene, this world in which I am a part of, which I am making art, which involves trying to process history in a certain way. And in this case, it's through performances and art, performances that are a little bit frivolous. Another quote here from John Banville, who was going to be here later and isn't, that I think is a little bit relevant to this too. Someone trolled him, of course, by asking him what did he think about young writers in Ireland. It's like anybody asking a writer of a certain vintage who is male what they think about young writers in Ireland is really asking them, what do you think about the Rooney thing, and everyone that came after it. But his response was, fiction writers in Ireland now seem just to be writing about their immediate lives and the lives of their friends. That wasn't the point at all for my generation. We were interested in what people are, not what they do. I disagree. I see his point, and I think it's a variant on McEwen's point, and I have the same response. I don't think as a writer I feel able to tell you what human nature is, or to have a character who represents an enlightened everyman. I feel a lot more like my view of the world is small and dim and partial, and that in the writing I want to do, I need to capture that a little. So one way this happens in this book is having the characters attempt to make art. And this is also a bit of a risk in a book, because if you write a character who's a writer, your reader is going to think it's you. So in this case, I had to make him a photographer, so I could hide that idea that when I was thinking about art making, I was thinking about my own art making. But also, you better not put anything in there that's crap and actually tell them it's good art, because the reader will then think you don't know what you're talking about. So I felt safer writing about people making art that's maybe not that impressive. So I'll read another section from it here. This is Cormac and Nina, who is a woman who's a little bit younger than him, who he has dalliances with every now and then. They have a sort of erotic friendship. And she used to be one of his students back in the day. And they're talking about, they're both artists, so they're having a discussion about that. Nina now laughs loudly as they ring through the door of the Christian book and coffee shop. It is partly a joke and partly an indulgence of curiosity to come, as they often do, to the Christian book and coffee shop. Nina likes the reproductions of Harry Clarke on the walls, but dislikes the zoomorphic retellings of Bible tales. She searches each time for a recording of the song she learned at school about unicorns too daft and distracted to remember to get to the ark, unicorns who drowned at the end of the song and never, she says, left her thoughts, before they find a table underneath a hot little sconce. Tell me more about the igloo, he demands. I don't want to talk about it yet, she says. I'm up to here with this show. I had a studio visit and everything yesterday, and you know how you worry for days before a studio visit and waste all this time even in advance. I haven't had one for years. I'm above it or past it, one of those things. What, she asks, did you think of the laundry show? When Cormac pulls a face, Nina says, yeah, very worthy, I know. Alice liked it. I was going to write about that show, she tells him now, and see about reviewing it. I'm sure Alice will be delighted to print a review for you in Lux. Ha, Nina says. Cormac pardons himself to use the bathroom. He has drunk too much coffee and passes a stingingly liquid stool. He returns to the table feeling lightheadedly refreshed. After this, you know, she raises her coffee cup to her lips, I will have to get back to work. I have no plans tonight. You should come over. Oh yeah, she teases, and what if I have plans? Cancel them. No, not really. If you have plans, come over afterwards. I'll have to see, she says. Tell me about the igloo, he persists. Is it all about monks? I should say the igloo is a sculpture she's been making that he's seen from above and thinks looks like an igloo. Tell me about the igloo, he persists. Is it all about monks? Well, she says, does it look like a playhouse to you? A little bit. Genius is the recovery of childhood at will. Very nice, he says. Rambo, Nina says. So is it about childhood, monks and cells? Monks and cells and childhood, she says, because Skellig Michael and the monks are childhood, the childhood of the island, genius of the land, recovery of childhood at will. Didn't you have to learn about monasteries at school and fairy forts? And crayon it all in. Childhood of the island. She is tracing a circle on the tabletop. Religion. She gestures about them. Illuminations, she adds. Illuminated manuscript. Intriguing, he says. So what are you working on? Teaching. Teaching takes over these days. I'll have to get more time soon. You've been saying that for ages, she says. Come with me to the institute then, and I'll show you some stuff. That'll shut you up. I have to work. No, you don't, Nina. She was one of his first students. This is why he tries to explain things to her. When I was starting out, he tries to explain, beauty was the enemy. Beauty was bourgeois. We were all about the ugly and the in-your-face. Did it have its own kind of beauty, she asks. Now you go into a fancy restaurant and the pipes are all exposed. I know what you mean. When I was a kid, he continues, the town hall in my hometown smelled of vomit. A very specific quality of vomit. The smell of vomited chickadees, corn snacks. Do you remember chickadees? I think it's pronounced chickadees. No, these were 10-penny corn snacks. They were chickadees. Trust me and shut up and listen, okay? Nina laughs. Anyway, the smell was so distinct, I can think of it now, I can remember it. That was fine ugliness. Fine, artful ugliness. I had this idea of reproducing it and bottling it, but the town hall was demolished years ago. They built over the square. The town square was originally a kind of warren of public toilets. Now that the toilets are gone, I imagine there must be some kind of queer, history associated with them. The toilets were stinking, lurking blue bulb light. He never went further than the top of the stairs. I came to art school, he continues, and all this ugliness was in. I felt like somehow I was in, but only in reified form, you understand. We should record this conversation, she says, and publish it. Imagine posterity missing out. So they continue in their conversation for a while, and they sort of have this flirty back and forth, and then ultimately they do spend the night together. What I was intending with this was to talk a little bit in the middle of this book about art making, which is sort of sarcastic, about attempting to make art and the experience of that. So the idea of ugliness and beauty and form is sort of a little bit present in the book, because when I write, I'm very interested in the style being quite beautiful and elegant, and that is something that has always been the case with me, but it can sometimes be alienating for readers, I think, and that's some of the feedback I get too, that it can be hard to follow what I'm saying, and I think when I read it aloud, I realize that it can be hard to follow as well, because there is a sort of conscious stylistic attempt that I'm making, which I think is, I have a kind of interesting psychological relationship with it because I can't stop doing it. To me, when I wrote this book, I wrote it in very plainer, Hemingway-esque language. And then when I published it, I read it, I realized that I hadn't done that. And I think that's because, as you can probably tell, I tend to think in digressions that go off in different directions, and it interests me to write to reflect that. But in this conversation, I'm also talking about my experience of processing my own early life. So I had Cormac, who's older than me and a man, come from the same place that I come from, the same town. And I didn't name it, but I put in little allusions to the places around the town. And there's other sequences later on where he's thinking about this. He's grown up in a family where there isn't really any education or regard for culture. But he realizes when he goes to college that in and of itself, his identity is something he could process into a cultural artifact. So when he's thinking about the toilets, in Balbriggan, where I'm from, the town square really was a subterranean public toilet for a long time. I think this is amazing now, that was the best thing they thought to put in the middle of it. I think it's probably the case in a lot of towns that were market towns. So they were these terrifying, if you can imagine a child, like if you think about Freud, looking in this, like down these steps into a toilet at the center of the sort of space. And I realize now that they're gone, there must have been some weird stuff going on in a toilet in the middle of a town. Like, it never occurred to me, but you could queer that. And it's almost like this sort of sense that, I could queer that, I could aestheticize that. And yet it's also just a reality of life. And what he's often trying to do is get closer to the sense of life happening around him, as culturally speaking, the discourse around it makes it more and more, now the word I use is reified, it's an academic word, I really mean sort of frozen as an object you can recognize. So the fact that in the opening of the story, I want to give the reader this sense that you're walking into a stage set that looks a bit like a surreal nightmare version of a building like this. Because this is exactly what I mean. These sort of ecclesiastical buildings that are in everybody's childhood in Ireland in a big way, that form part of your early register of images and have these meanings that have become detached from anything real. And where this couple, as they're talking, decide to go, the institute, is actually the Grange Gorman Asylum in Dublin, which is now a DIT campus, which was at one point a very large, walled, insane asylum for a very long time. And around the time I began writing it, the archives had been acquired by Trinity, and there was conversations about privacy and redacting the content and what they had done to people. And there's this sense, particularly in, I think, working class Irish people, of knowing people, or knowing a practice of giving people involuntary electroconvulsive therapy, particularly in the 50s, if they cracked up. So this is a time when Ireland is living under a very oppressive regime, and people are reacting to this by having various forms of nervous breakdown, and the response a lot of the time is to give them ECT and then put them back out. And there is some statistic, I think it's the 40s and 50s, where Ireland has more people per capita in asylums than any other country in Europe. So they have this way of coping with people where they just sort of, and this happened in my own family, this kind of zapped them and sent them out, and no one would talk about it again. And now the space has been opened up, and it's a campus, it's a university campus. And I mean, this is just gold for a writer who wants to think about women's suffering and suffering of the working class in Ireland in a bourgeois novel that doesn't look like it's about that. So I have these two people walk around this campus, and what's hanging in the background is this sense of very strange and mysterious human experiences have happened in this place that are not really being talked about. But at the same time, they're very aware of it, and they talk about how it used to be a lunatic asylum. And I brought in an image I saw in a film about Ivan, the psychiatrist Ivan. Yes, where he talked about walking into the ward one night and looking around at all the women and saying, all the mothers of Dublin are here. And it was such a good way of putting it, like all the mothers are warehoused here, this kind of, and then when they had found all the lost property in Grange Gorman, I think it's in Trinity now, loads of it is handbags. And this idea that women were maybe committed on their way down the road, or they expected to go home, and then they never left, and their handbag was taken away. And these little images are like shocking little shots of something that's been lost. And as an artist, he's walking through this Dublin where people are putting on shows. The women around him are trying to tell him very clearly how they're suffering from various things, and they want to talk about it, and he can't really hear it because it's all just kind of underground. The reason I give you all of this context is because I published this book with an English publisher. My editor is English, my agent is English. These things don't translate at all. So most of it was not visible to my editor. And again, to talk about feedback then, I got a general sense that some Irish people were really charmed by the depiction of Dublin being very close to reality and saying, it's very familiar to me, this place. Whereas other readers didn't get that. I mean, there was one person who said, great if you're Irish, but I can't understand what you would get out of this geography if you weren't. And I'm not really sure about that, because I do think people have a certain imaginative generosity, but it is true that there are two layers of significance to it. Because if you're reading as a non-Irish person with no familiarity with Dublin or any of these signifiers, it's just a space for a human drama. And then there's not a lot of human drama. So a review it got in the Sunday Times, the point made was this is just all about moods. This is a book in which people have moods and nothing happens, which is true. But it's like, yes, but the moods are political and meaningful, and and that's kind of lost. But the decision I made to keep it so local and parochial and so provincial, I knew that was going to happen, and I knew it wasn't going to translate. But I decided to do it because I think returning to that experience of writing the first book and not having an audience, there was a memory of feeling no loyalty to any market-researched readership and simply saying, I'm just going to write what I think is important here and hope that it translates in some way. And the result of that has really been that it's translated in all these kind of unexpected different ways, but ultimately it hasn't traveled like This Happy did. It hasn't gotten where I thought it would go, I think because I've handicapped it by making it so kind of claustrophobic. So the question now is writing the third novel, having done these two things. And I did have a conversation with my editor and publishers that said, we've had a great time. We put out 2 books in the pandemic. I've achieved my dream, but we haven't really made any money. Why is that? And then the response I got very quickly was, well, you don't write plot. Like, I don't know how to describe you to people. I don't know how to sell you to anybody. You're just not doing. And I was like, you're absolutely right. I don't. And I do wonder, do I want to stay in my precious little room just sort of doing moods? Or do I want to push myself to be the kind of person who might write that State of the Nation realist? Because I agree with Kevin Power that the idea of realism as a way of thinking is useful. And I think what he means by that is a defense of books about only what happens, ordinary life, which will tend for most people writing in the Anglophone West to be basically similar in a lot of its sort of furnishings, especially if you live in a city, and can seem as if it is maybe lazily speaking into middle-class fiction or serving an existing market. But what I'm interested in is where the weirder, stranger, more disruptive elements of life come into that template. So recently I was in a work context talking to a writer named Sarah Franklin in England who is doing a PhD that's really very, very promising and interesting. But she had come from publishing for many years, and she talked about the kind of unconscious bias and gatekeeping in publishing around what kind of stories they believe people will pay for and what doesn't get through as a result of that. And her position was, in her case, the experience of the British rural working class. It was difficult to process this without making the characters into types. In Irish writing, I think we have a history of that being an issue as well. Less so now, but still there's a question of what kind of character and story would this imagined readership accept? And I would say that these days it's characterized by quite accessible personality types. If you're a woman, relatability. Usually plot, although I am coming around to plot and I don't want to cast too much shade on it. Perhaps I was afraid of it for so long because it's very hard. But also, there are sort of states of mind that are not maybe accepted quite so much in contemporary fiction. With Cormac, I wanted to show somebody who completely refuses, and if you read the book you'll see, to develop in any way. He does not change, he does not learn, and he does not get punished. And his final scene in the book is just someone breaking up with him, and then that's it. And I got to the end of the book and thought, Jesus, this is hilarious. I sent it to my friend, and she said, I don't see where your character can go except death. And I thought, wow, I'm going to leave it like that. That's exactly what I want you to think. Because in the context of this novel, which is a story, it's artificial, this person doesn't have life because they're not developing. But so many people really in life, they don't develop in this narrative way. So they do stay where they are, and I wanted to capture that. So that's probably another reason why the book maybe hasn't translated as well, because I thought, no, I'm going to leave him here. But I did cheat a little. I decided to bring in one of the female satellite cast to finish the book. And when I was doing that, I thought, this is a big risk. My publisher is either going to write to me and say, did you just cut a bit out of your last novel, stick it at the end of this novel, and attempt to make your deadline? But she didn't. She said, no, I get it, that's great, let's go with it. But in a way, the voice, it was the young and tense, makes bad romantic decisions art girl came back in and finished the book. Which I think is interesting because she sort of had to do it in order to get the book over the line. So it was this very interesting psychodramatic experience that I had in lockdown where I needed like my old character to come and fix the new. But maybe I'll try and find some kind of conclusion to my rambling thoughts. I guess with the third one, yes, we talked about how to do something that is breaking away from this kind of very introspective, very much indulging my interest in Irish history and art and the performance of identity and Dublin, without writing exactly the same book again. And I had this State of the Nation plan with this big, big plan with all of these characters, and this is going to come in, then that's going to come in. And I've been sort of workshopping it, reading it myself, writing little bits, finding it falling apart really immediately. And my partner was reading it and just said, look, I feel as though you just want to write a first-person intense narrative set over 1 week, and this is what you want to do, and this is what you should do. You should actually just cut all of this out and once again do this person, this individual with the world, who is not representative of any kind of type, and simply having a turbulent time. And I won't say any more than that, like there is a plot, but where I am interested in is in this consciousness of the individual once again, and only that. So now I'm kind of tentatively going in that direction and feeling at every moment like one of the great risks when you've written 2 books, I now see, is that everything you write sounds derivative of you. So when I write, I sometimes feel as though I got a bot and then read my first and second book to it, and now the bot generates algorithmically. And this is also me, I think, butting heads against the limits of my own personality and where I can really go at this point in my life with fiction. So that is, I suppose I will finish on this observation then. There's a reader, an audience, a market, an image. There's what you get when you Google someone, then there's big advances and small advances, and then there's the person as product. But at the bottom of it for me, it has always just been some kind of attempt for me to figure out, I suppose, a way out of myself, a way of communicating with the world what I think is important, which feels a lot of the time very pre-verbal, through language, and then trying to put that in a box, which is called a realist novel, in order to send it out into the world. And maybe that is what lots of people are experiencing, or maybe it is just me, I don't know. But thank you for listening to me. We have a couple of minutes, so I might go to questions now.
Do we need a microphone? Or, yeah, okay, but I think I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question. That was brilliant. And I just wanted to pick up on the point about publishing and always chasing. It's not really, if it's a literary novel, it has to be the next Sally Rooney. If it is a crime novel, it has to be the next Paula Hawkins. If it's a children's book, it has to be the next J.K. Rowling. It's just, and it seems to have got worse, I'm going to use the word. I mean, I had bookshops in South London for nearly 20 years. And I saw it happening, you know, like once say like the Paula Hawkins sold millions of copies, they wanted the next crime novel so that they could walk into the bookshops and say, you need to stock this because it's the next, you know, big crime novel. But that, I feel it's just in the UK and the States. I don't feel it's in Ireland. I mean, do you think it is here yet with Irish publishers?
No, I don't think it's here yet at all, no. I think Irish publishing is very indie-based and follows its own whims, actually, which is actually kind of significant. It really is more of a case of if it goes to the UK, which is interesting because then you have this idea about how Ireland is perceived from England and all kinds of questions around that. But yeah, no, I would agree with you. It comes from New York and London, really.
Yeah, it does. And I think also it is London. It's I know that there are swathes of Northern England and Scotland who also find all the publishing is London-centric. And I don't know if Mia is in the audience. She's you know, she was born in Dublin, and she's an editor at Fourth Estate. And she says, like, weekly, she's having conversations about, no, they don't get that there's life happening outside London. So it's a big problem. Anybody like to ask any questions?
Thanks for that. That was really interesting. Oh, the mic's not working. Oh, it is. Hello. I was just wondering, yeah, picking up on that point, I suppose. I mean, how much... It sounds like there's a lot of conflicts, obviously, between the fact that you have this publishing industry, and as soon as you have an industry, it's about making money. And then how do you... If you're trying to create something which is... If writing is a voyage of discovery, and there's something to literature which is aesthetic, as opposed to what Campbell would, the difference between, say, an aesthetic and pornography, where you're just trying to sell milk and the beautiful woman, or the man, and that's how, I'm interested in artists like, I think of a band like Radiohead, for instance, and they did OK Computer, which was supposed to be, the record company went into it, but it was huge, and then just keep creating that. The U2 thing or Coldplay thing, and you become more and more commercial. Are you conscious of that you could... And I'm thinking as well, particularly because you're very political and intellectual and everything like that, and self-aware of what's going on around you and within you. Where do the sort of... I wonder where more experimentation and modernism seems to come... Because I think this is coming through, this kind of... It seems like there's a revisiting of modernism.
Yeah. That
people are becoming more experimental and changing. That the way to... break through that is, but that's the difficulty, because how does that sell? And there's very few writers. Harold Pinter was one, Shakespeare, Deborah Levy, someone who they don't compromise, I find, on their art, but they can still reach a wide audience, which is always an extraordinary thing to do.
Yeah.
I don't really know what I'm asking, but...
No, I know what you mean. It's the question of, well, if you would like to subvert, why not subvert formally? Yes. Yeah. And suspecting, perhaps, that sometimes the answer is, well, that's too niche, But I think for me, I don't tend to experiment formally, and I'm not sure why. It doesn't appeal to me that much personally, and I think this might be because I do really love the realist novel, and I do really enjoy this mode.
But isn't that danger that you'll slip into a kind of Victorian almost?
Yes. Yeah. To try to break through. Yeah, I think maybe I'm very influenced by McGahern, who I would say writes realism through Beckett. So he does realism, but he doesn't quite Beckett. He doesn't quite go there. You can still recognize where they're set and there's a plot. But he uses the sort of stripping away and the very well-placed, frighteningly too photorealist moment to kind of jar the reader. I was very influenced by him doing that. But to think about how to get an audience without compromising yourself. Yes, I really love realist writing. I do enjoy reading it. I think that to talk about political subversion, I mean, I'm not really referring to 19th century. I think I mean writing that sets out to reflect a shared reality, which is a gamble. To say, I'm going to say, I believe you're all seeing this room as I see it. I'm going to proceed from that position. I believe there's a common... It's a genre. So if you're writing into it, you're saying, I'm entering into this genre where people have commented on reality, the most important thing. It's not about fantasy, it's not about surrealism, it's not about dream state, it's about reality. Most people, I think, probably it's the most read, perhaps, form of the novel, especially in literary fiction, literary terms, because there's a degree of familiarity. But what I'm interested in politically, and I'll try and make this point clearly, is not works that give you political information or positions explicitly, but works that accidentally reveal how they have been conditioned by the political moment. And that can be the fact that, say, in Sally Rooney's writing, the Irishness is very visible to me, is really dialed up, but doesn't translate, I don't think, to readers in New York, for instance, at all, without the book's suffering from that at all. But for me, the kernel of the disruptive in that book is that Irish element. It doesn't, I could talk about this for a long time and I won't, but it's that extra bit. So say in a scene in my book, we go to Grange Gorman, we have an older man, a younger woman having a sexual wordplay, but I really want to talk to you about how his mother was electrocuted. And this is the reason why there is all this sort of strangeness in the book, is because this mind has been destabilized and it's running through the family, and that is because of treatment of the working class in Irish history. But I'm not going to say that at all, because then I'd be giving you information and saying, look at this political outrage. I prefer that you just have a realist scene, and what I would hope is that the reader feels that something doesn't really add up, or something feels a bit off or strange. But that doesn't answer your question at all. I think it's a worthy criticism to say if you really want to subvert, you can be subversive, but you just risk completely losing your audience. And I guess what I'm desiring to do as a writer is really communicate and be heard. So there's some kind of like very desiring, selfish motion in me that wants that. So that's possibly why I tend to prefer to stick with realism. So maybe there's cowardice there.
I don't think I've just got one question. Really, I'm interested in name check McGahern, of course, and Danny did that earlier on. But I'd like to know maybe who your literary foremothers are.
Ah, yes. Yeah. It's Elizabeth Bowen, mostly. Yeah, I just, pure pleasure. And I have always had a fondness for Kate O'Brien, I think, because she's so very OTT and romantic. I really love that about her. But also that she's describing a very provincial world, and I'm really fond of that provincialism. It's quite unashamedly feminine in its emphasis. But Jean Rhys was an influence on the first book as well. I thought both in her sort of slim impressionistic experimental kind of style, but also her concern with this like very lonely, unrepentant female figure. She's like a scary patron saint of that, I think. Kind of like before you have Sylvia Plath, you have Jean Rhys. Four Mothers is a good one, though. I would have been very formatively influenced by Anne Enright. I think I continue to be influenced by Anne Enright every time I read her work. But yeah, that's a couple I could give. But this is an interesting question, because I did study English and I did a master's and a PhD. And most of the canon that we were taught was still very male at that time. And it was an atmosphere at the time in Irish university in the early noughties when there wasn't any self-conscious attempt at being particularly feminist, I don't think, in the lessons. So we did kind of read a lot of men, which is not a problem. But also I read them with any kind of sense of myself as a woman reading them and being someone this wasn't really addressed to, or who was implicitly kind of outside of it, came naturally. So particularly with McGahern. I remember reading The Pornographer by McGahern, which is one of my favorite books. It's such a good book. It's incredibly misogynist. And at the same time, I could read this and be like, as a woman, I feel really uncomfortable with this. But I didn't live in a culture where that would immediately translate to a kind of Twitter thing where I would give out about it. Instead, it just kind of closed over me, and I thought, well, you're wrong, but I can take from this. So a lot of my literary influences are male, and I feel I kind of need to apologize for that. But it's because I think I did read them as a woman, and it felt like a subversive experience all the time, rather than being a kind of regenerative or triumphant reading. It was kind of a little bit more pessimistic, and that helped me become an artist.
I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to call a halt to the chat, because it's been absolutely fantastic. I think we could
Thank you.
go
I really
on.
hope it wasn't incoherent.
No,
I was trying to plan it for ages, and it wouldn't come together. So, thank you very much.
No,